Um, Thank you very much. So the talk that I'm giving now is pretty much following up from Miguel's presentation, as I'm actually doing a study on the kind of narrative, or in my case, they call visions, expectations, and promises in a very near future, near present. So the topic today I would like to focus on is about discerning the credibility of expectations from a link ecology perspective. So at first I want to talk a little bit about the background of my case study, and then present a few premises of expectation in technical innovations. And then we'll talk a little bit about how expectation credibility is viewed in the lens of the sociology of expectations and their shortcomings, and how I try to overcome it with the link ecology's perspective, and conclude it with some remarks. So in my PhD, I studied the Copyright Hub. It is an initiative that is triggered by a series of public inquiry into the IP reform in the UK. It started in November 2010 with David Cameron's speech about trying to turn London into Silicon Valley. And in his speech, he talked about two things. He tried to develop a network of technologies and innovation centers in the UK. And the second thing he wanted to do is to review the UK IP framework. And it's come as a shock to the spectators, because even to his closest ally, it's appeared to come from out of the blue. And even more shockingly, he appointed Professor Nguyen, whose background is a journalist, and he has no background in IP law. And he only given 6 months to compile a whole review of the UK IP framework, which is a huge task. And in his report, he concluded that the IP legislation in the UK is falling behind the development of the technologies, and therefore there should be more copyright exceptions. And he also suggested that the UK should pioneer by create a digital copyright exchange, which allows the copyright licensing process to be streamlined. And in order to tackle this task, Richard Hooper was appointed to do a feasibility study on the digital copyright exchange ideas. And in March 2012, in his first report, he's focused on copyright instead of IP as a whole. So copyright is a subset of IP. And he said that regarding copyright licensing, there are many things that can be done to streamline the process. And therefore, the idea of the digital copyright exchange is justified. And in his second report, he proposed the construction of the Copyright Hub. And it's take a while, like a waiting game for the industry and the government trying to figure out who will make the first move. And by October, November 2012, the creative industry gave in, and they agreed to provide funding for the first phase of the Copyright Hub. So they established the Copyright Hub licensing steering group and the Copyright Hub launch group. And in March 2013, the government signaled their green light by saying that they will invest 150,000 K into the project to kickstart the Copyright Hub. And one part of the story is the technology and innovation centers. That whole stream of work create a number of catapults in the UK, and one of them, which is important to the story, is the digital catapult, which become operational in 2013. And this whole unfolding story happened in the context of UK in 2010 and afterward, where the country is plunged into the financial crisis, and the main priority of the government is try to stimulate the economies. So, what is the vision of the Copyright Hub? The Copyright Hub is supposed to be an initiative to streamline the copyright licensing process across sectors and across national boundaries. And it do so by, if you have a system A and system B which use different data schema or vocabulary, and therefore because of their different in structure they cannot talk to each other. And the corporate hub allows a process of mapping where it's allowed a data value in, for example, one data schema to be translated into the second data schema, and thus allow the two systems to talk to each other. And it's supposed to enable the prospect of being able to search across different kind of system and across sectors. And there's another vision of the corporate hub is that it will address the long tail of the market, which is the idea of Anderson in 2006 when he theorized that because of digital technologies, the retail market will move away from the big hit, which is the head, and move way to the long tail of very niche, but there is a massive number of products in that long tail. And the narrative behind the corporate hub project is that, well, we will focus on the long tail where there is no market or there's no mechanism to exploit this market, and therefore will create a new market that will increase the revenue for everyone. So that's a very interesting case study, and I was in the middle of what is happening at that time in 2012, 2013 when I was looking for idea for PhD, and it's happening at that moment, but it's also bring a lot of challenges into the study of such an exciting case study. First of all, because it's a very nascent project, there are a lot of uncertainty, and with uncertainty, there are much higher risks to study them, and mostly they act on the basis of expectations and promises rather than fact. And secondly, it's a very interesting but complex settings where you have to deal with actors in multiple communities or ecologies. So we have policy makings who make policies about IP. You have businesses, the creative industry and the technology sectors competing against each other to gain a favorable IP policies. And you also need the people from the IP standard development community as well. So it is within this intersection that the Corporate Hub initiative happened. So to study this kind of challenging project, I draw on the kind of sociology of expectations, because it's the man driven behind all of these changes and all of the initiatives that stick people together and put them behind the bandwagon of the corporate hub. So what is expectation? Expectation is a state of looking forward, but in the context of technical innovations, it means real-time representations of future technological situation and capabilities. And the sociology of expectation, they focus more on what expectation do rather than what it trying to define it. So it's a quote from Valente, a founding father of this field, when he said that the central theme is it's not the expectation or the statement that do something, but rather it being a descriptive. It's about doing something, but not a descriptive statement of what it can be true or false. And he summarized that expectations in technical change can have three kinds of forces. The first is legitimations, where it helps attract attentions using inflated promises, and by doing so legitimize the investment into the new innovation, whereby they hope that something good will come in return for the early investment. And heuristic guidance, because with an open pathway and unlimited possibilities, they have to rely on expectation circle within that circle to know which is the promised part, and coordinations where expectation help specify role and clarify duty, and they offer a kind of shared understanding of risk as well as opportunities. So expectation is considered a kind of missing link between the inner and outer world of techno-scientific knowledge community and fields. And scholars in sociology of expectation, they try to give a typology of expectations by dividing them into 2 or 3 types of expectation. It could be a specific expectation that attribute to individual or specific group, or it could be collective expectations that is generalized, taken for granted, and become social repertoire. It shared by a wide range of actors, and most importantly, it has a kind of performative aspect to it. That is, it's able to motivate and coordinate heterogeneous actors in the innovation process. But more recent study, for example, by Pollock and Williams, they argue that there aren't just 1 or 2 kind of expectation, but actually there is a full spectrum of expectation that being used by innovation actors. On the top right of the model, you can have a kind of very carefully developed and vigorously defended expectation, which has an enduring influence on the market. And you also have the kind of on the bottom left, where it's a kind of provocations, where it doesn't really matter, it doesn't hold account to anybody. You just throw it into the ether to attract the attention for a short period of time. So we know that expectation play a critical role in innovation journey, but what do we know about expectation credibility? From the point of view of sociology of expectations, they admitted that they haven't got a clear clue on why some ideas seem to be more resonant at a given moment than others. And there are several attempts to try to address this kind of issues. For example, Calonne, in his study of the French electric vehicle, he proposed he tried to describe the mechanism of how engineer sociologists use different means to create a heterogeneous association that allow their vision of the new future world of electric vehicle to come by. But it also has shortcomings when it depends very much on the direct interaction between actors, and it's unable to accommodate indirect social mechanism. And it also cannot explain by the end of the case study why renowned reversal of the accepted social technical scenario. A more recent work by Conrad, he proposed the model of the social dynamic of expectations, where he focused on the collective expectations, and he argued that when collective expectations are accepted, they will eclipse other visions. And when it becomes a social repertoire, it will exert certain image pressures that coerce other actors to make the vision come true. And the interpretations of the outcome of the project, when the collective expectations are intact, it will influence how people interpret that outcome. But also it comes with shortcoming when it's unable to explain why a collective expectation will eclipse other alternative visions, or why it becomes taken for granted, and it doesn't match with our understanding of typologies of promiscuous behavior as proposed by Pollock and Williams. And it doesn't give us a nice framework to analyze the case study or to learn the dynamics of the case study of the copyright hub. In the latest development of the field, I find the notion of Arena's expectation is quite useful, where they theorized that apart from the bridging event, people also engage in a numerous asynchronous arena of expectation where the enactor will feeding continuously expectations to the selectors, whereby the selector is informed and making their own criteria and picking the promising options and provide a further mandate to future work on certain directions of technologies development. But still they have to admit that they still not fully understood the reason behind why some options are thought to be more credible than the other. Like in the study of the hydrogen program in the US, they argue that from both the enactors as well as the selectors' perspective, the same type of construction seems to be regarded as credible. And they say that an enactor anticipates the assessment and the selector construct their criteria externally and make judgment on what is promising and what is not. And there are 3 criteria for it. But my point is, how do we use this kind of theorizations in the case study of the Copyright Hub? Because it's certainly assumed that there is one ecologies of actors and with fixed boundary, and we have selectors at an audience sitting there unproblematic, and they make external judgment on what is the promising options to conduct further study. And this is what Abbott called the ecology audience models. And we have seen from the descriptions of the case study of the Copyright Hub, it's working in the intersection of different ecologies. So it does not work with a kind of ecologies audience model that presented in the arena of expectations. So that's why I came up, I borrowed the notions of linked ecologies perspective from Abbott, when he assumed that there is no fixed surrounding between an ecologies, and each ecologies act as a flexible surrounding for one another. And one of the striking argument that he's made is that any successful development project must bring together some combinations of actors across all of the ecologies instead of one. And each actors do not act alone, but they work in an alliance of actors across the ecologies, and they fight against each other to promote their own idea of what is the promising technologies. And that's the idea of the hinges, where both sides of ecologies are looking for something in return for their engagement in their relationship. And therefore, a hinges or a strategies only work when it can provide multiple awards for actors in both ecologies at once. And I would like to explore how the idea of linked ecologies can be applied into the case study of the Copyright Hub, and see what can the success of the Copyright Hub be explained by seeing it as strategies that work for multiple actors in different ecologies at the same time. Through my data collections, it's revealed that the Copyright Hub provides multiple awards for the creative industry, firstly. So for them, the imminent threat was the threat of further copyright exceptions by the UK government. And they've been using the Copyright Hub as a kind of blockage to prevent any further changes to the IP legislation to be made, by arguing that if we can, using technology to streamline our work, there is no need for further changes in the policies. And it shifts the focus from policy issues to technical matters, and it shifts the whole narrative around that issues with it. And here's another quote from a veteran data architect where he talked about the first time when they heard of this initiative, and they say that it's a community brought together by fear, by pressures, and they have to be there themselves even if nothing was going to happen. And remember, it's a technical project. And it's a quote from a chairman of publishing industry associations, where he said that the political need for the corporate hub is as important or even more important than the commercials or the technical need. So the industry not necessarily need new technologies to help them with their work, but they really need it in political terms to help them fight back the imposing of further corporate exceptions by the government. Therefore, the corporate hub offers a defensible position from which the industry could find off the new corporate exceptions that have been threatened to impose by the government. It also strikingly provides a word for the government as well. When they're taking on the corporate hub initiative, it's helped them stabilize the process of policy makings and delegate the responsibility for stimulating the economy to the private sectors. So how does it help them stabilize the policy making process? Here is a series of policy, like 4 in a very short period of time, policy interventions into the IP domain by the government, and it changed all the time. And by embracing the corporate hub as a development of an infrastructures, it's lengthened the time scale, and it's allowed them to not having to deal with the short, rapid rebundling of political agendas, and focus on developing an infrastructure, whether it's go anywhere or not, but it's accepted to be taken a long time, and it helps stabilize the process of policy makings. And it also provides another reward for the government by they promise that the corporate hub will help create another 2.2 billion annually for the UK economy by 2020. And remember that it's the government in the 2015, and by 2020 they no longer in the power, and it's irrelevant to them whether they will reach this kind of promises or not. And it's a clear evidence of a kind of provocation that they just throw out there in order to gain a kind of short-lived influence. But it doesn't matter, because for them, they have a different cycle in the political arena where they will be out of power by the time they reach this kind of promises time scale. So for the government, the corporate hub has helped to sustain the kind of long-term vision, economic growth, and help them strengthen the program of actions to stimulate the economy. Because at the time, the government tried to cut public funding very sharply, and it's a kind of tool for the government to justify their actions. And it's also provide a word for IP standard development communities, because from the interview, they say that for the IP standard development community, the problem of linked data is that it's too academic, it's too obscure in terms of technologies, and only by having resources provided by the creative industry and not only providing a word, but the hub has to be presented as a harmless initiative to all the stakeholders involved in the process. They try to show that They're not going to take away any businesses. They're not frightening any old business model, or even they're not trying to coerce the technology sector into doing something that they don't want to do. So I guess through these discussions, there are a few remarks I want to make. Firstly, I would like to revisit the notions that Baker, Valenti, and Miss made on the fact that both the enactors and the selectors see the kind of the same kind of construction seems to be regarded as credible, because through the analysis that I have just made, it seems like for them and expectations is viewed very differently by actors in different ecologies, and for them an expectation can provide a different kind of work if it's work in those ecologies. And therefore in the linked ecology context, it's unproductive to think of a value or the credibility of an expectation as intrinsic value, but it should be judged using within the context of that case study. So we should understand the credibility of expectations within the context of their own linked ecologies in terms of how they help provide hinges to forge alliances between different actors. And therefore the strength of the expectation credibility is associated with the strength of the alliance behind it. And it also helps to explain the mechanism why certain expectations raise into become a social repertoire. It's only happened when they can gather a strong alliance behind them. And with that alliance in place, it's very difficult to displace them. And therefore it eclipses any kind of alternative visions on the future technologies. And because we have a full spectrum of expectations, therefore we should not think of them in individual terms, but we should think of them in a kind of a constellations of expectations and all the alliances that they stand behind. And that's all of my presentation for now.